Okay. Okay, with me today, I have Heather Culp, a consumer bankruptcy attorney in North Carolina. Heather and I have kind of in some ways shared information on the internet, and Heather shares a lot of information about consumer bankruptcy and student loans, and I've always wanted to chat with her and interview her and just talk about the interesting topic of student loans and how those play out in bankruptcy cases, and are they ever dischargeable? And Heather, what's the story with student loans and bankruptcy? Can you wipe those out in a bankruptcy case?
Well, thanks for having me. This is a nice thing to do on a Friday. My answer to that is generally no. It's a super high burden, and the burden is different depending on the law of your district. But here in North Carolina, in the Fourth Circuit, and in the Western District of North Carolina in particular, which is where I practice, it's a very high bar. This is a fairly conservative district and a fairly conservative circuit. There are arguments other places in the country that are interesting and that I think you're following and I'm following, but they have not taken hold here. I think the second thing is it's expensive to litigate these issues, and most of the people that I meet with and you meet with, if they had the money to litigate that, they wouldn't be filing a bankruptcy in the first place. So I think when you put those two things together, whenever somebody calls me, a potential client wanting to talk about discharging student loans, I pretty much tell them straight up, unless there's something here that I'm missing, and we'll go through those things, that's not going to happen for you.
Yeah, you and I have been practicing long enough to where we may have reached that point of our career where where certain people don't know as much as we have forgotten over time. And because when I first started practicing in this field, at that time, the standard was 7 years. If a student loan had been in repayment status, outside of deferments for more than 7 years, you could discharge it in bankruptcy. And prior to that, you could discharge it after 5 years. But in 2005, Congress passed a Bankruptcy Reform Act, which said you can never discharge student loans unless an undue hardship applies. And the standards for getting an undue hardship are substantially high, and I agree with you. Most of the people I meet they can't meet that burden because you're talking like it has to be something where you're either paralyzed or you have a super medical issue or some mental issue, which suggests that you couldn't even make some minimal payment.
A certainty of hopelessness. A certainty of hopelessness is the magic words here. And my former law partner for a long time, he's retired now, he would tell people, if you're deaf, blind, and missing all 4 limbs, you might have a 25% shot of proving undue hardship. And unfortunately, I think that's true.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that comes into play here is something that's been developing over time, which are these income-based repayment programs the Department of Education has unraveled over time. And I think there's at this point 10 different programs out there. There used to be, they used to call them income contingent plans. And I think that one started back in 1994. But I've never actually.
I was on that personally for a long time.
Okay.
Lawyer who didn't make very much money. Yeah. My first job out of law school, I graduated in 97 and I was making $17,000 a year as a staff attorney for the local state court. So, I did that for quite some time. Yeah.
Yeah. nothing quite like coming out of law school. I think law students generally these days come out of school, with certainly over 100,000 of debt, and 200 is not uncommon, with the promise of coming into an occupation, which I think nationwide, that people think lawyers actually make a lot, but a certain percent do. But I think the median income for an attorney in the United States is like 50,000 or less.
Right.
So the top half do okay. The
They
bottom
skew
half
it.
are struggling.
Yeah.
And I remember one lawsuit filed, one adversary proceeding in a bankruptcy case filed by an attorney who owed like 300,000 of debt. And I can't remember the case number, but it was kind of humorous because the attorney argued and argued and argued that I cannot earn this living. And he presented a very organized case. And the appeals court read it and said, well, you're obviously a very gifted attorney because you did a wonderful job on this case. And so we're going to deny your application because, you obviously can litigate, go out there and make money. Which is kind of like, that was kind of the worst result ever. Bankruptcy cases do not automatically discharge student loans unless the debtor files a lawsuit against Department of Education or against the private loan bank, something we call adversary proceedings. And I think you and I probably see that very few of those are filed. The ones that are filed, it seems like more than 50% of them are filed by debtors who are representing themselves because they can't afford an attorney to litigate, which doesn't always produce the best case law because they're not trained as attorneys, although some actually do some pretty amazing work. But the big defense Department of Education rolls out is, well, we have these flexible payment plans, get on an income-based program, and over typically 10 to 20 years, what you can't pay off, we wipe out. And do you see that defense used much in your area?
We just don't have very much litigation about it at all that I'm aware of. But yes, I'm aware anecdotally that is the main defense.
Yeah, and ironically, I think the 2005 bankruptcy law that banned the discharge of student loans was championed by President Biden, who at that time was Senator Biden, and he and the group went in and decided to make bankruptcy tough. And now he's supposedly flipped and is supporting a variety of measures, possibly to discharge these debts, some of them administratively. But I think he recently came out and said, well, I'm not going to sign an executive order. I want you guys in Congress to write a law that says what gets wiped out. And there's also some new bankruptcy law proposals out there, which I think Senator Warren has advanced, maybe to just allow these debts to be discharged like they used to be, just like any other debt. And I don't know the likelihood of that becoming law. I think it's maybe a little bit, I suspect there's going to be a lot of pushback in Congress where they say, well, gee whiz, maybe you have to pay on them a few years or something like that. So how are you counseling clients today who are filing bankruptcy with student loans? What suggestions are you making to them to deal with this debt?
It's a great question. And I made some notes, thinking about this topic today and anticipating what we might be talking about. A few things come to mind, a handful. Number one is especially for lower income, what I would consider lower middle class folks. It's important, I think, for them to know that unpaid tuition and fees, that's not an educational loan, that's dischargeable. I'll have people come in with $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 of that from one semester at an online for-profit, and that can make a big difference to them. Likewise, not to get too technical, but the institution that made the loan has to be recognized by the Department of Education as qualified, and there's a big list that's maintained. So a lot of trade schools like trucking schools or pilot schools, that those don't count as educational loans. They don't fit within that category, and those are dischargeable. Like I say, I don't see that very often, but that can be meaningful to people when it does apply.
Yeah, and I think if a school closes down, and there's been
Right.
some for-profit schools
Right.
that closed down and a person couldn't finish their degree, then that becomes a dischargeable debt.
Yes.
I don't know if it's just per se dischargeable in bankruptcy, or if it's where you have to apply to Department of Education for.
You have to apply, is my understanding. And there's a list that a lot of this is online, especially if it's a Department of Education or a government website. I find it to be reliable. I think I tell people to watch, otherwise what they're reading on Google, because it may not be correct. But yeah, I mean, that's some, a potential avenue for relief as well. I mean, informally, I tell people to think long and hard before they refinance government loans into private loans. Within the last 3 or 4 years, all these cottage industry companies like SoFi, not to pick on them. I mean, I think, the service that they offer can work well for the right person. But I watch a lot of sports, and it seems like SoFi not only sponsors NFL stadiums, but they just have a ton of commercials about, we'll lower your monthly rate and we'll lower your interest rate. And I think people don't realize is that they're giving up a lot of government benefits or advantages
and it's a confusing topic, because I'll ask people, okay, you have student loans. Now, do you know if they're private? Do you know if they're government guaranteed? And because you can have a government guaranteed loan with the same bank, and some are private and some are not.
Right.
And the difference between those being that a private student loan, if you don't pay it, the government has not guaranteed the loan. They're not going to pay the bank for the loan. Whereas a government guaranteed student loan, the bank is guaranteed by the government. And all these special payment programs, income-based, forgivable over 10 or 20 years, that applies to government guaranteed student loans. But none of those programs exist in the private student loans. And so when you're a student acquiring the debt, knowing that, it's like, well, gee whiz, I should get a government guaranteed loan. But I've seen the financial aid office of different universities. Well, okay, so they're kind of working with the banks quite a bit. And I think it's a little bit easier to get the private loan, maybe. And so some schools are just signing up their students for private student loans, which have none of these repayment options.
No, and they don't have forbearances typically or deferments. One of the things that since COVID in the last year that I think has been really meaningful for people with student loans is it's just an automatic forbearance. It started in April, and it just meant you didn't have to make any payment at all through December. And then that's been extended through, I think, this September. You don't have to apply for anything. You don't have to fill out a form. You don't have to show means or lack of means. I mean, it's just automatic. You don't have to, you can choose to if you can afford it. But that's been a real lifeline for a lot of my folks who've been out of work. And that's just not an option for these private loans. So, I mean, that's some practical advice I try to get. Like you say, it can be very confusing for people.
It's extremely confusing. And you know, as one person told me, he says, in the whole student loan situation, unlike any other loan you get, there's no underwriting for the loan, meaning that the bank does not really assess the risk of not getting repaid because, well,
Because you can never escape.
yes. And so private student loans, I think, are probably the single worst debt that I deal with
I
because there are
agree. I
so few
agree.
options.
I agree.
Um, you know, I don't know how it is out in your area. I know the cases in our area and the Eighth Circuit, if somebody comes in to the bankruptcy court seeking a discharge and they have 10 loans, they look at each loan separately. But if they consolidate the loans, and it can be the same amount, then it's an all or nothing proposition. They can't discharge half of the loan and retain the other half. So I don't know if there's anything similar in your area as to how they review, at
I'm
what
not
level
aware
does
of
it?
that. I'm not
Mhm.
aware that it doesn't exist, but I haven't researched that and don't have an answer for that. That's an interesting, you're saying there's no partial discharge if you've consolidated.
Yeah, the loan is 100% discharged or it's not. And so
Hmm.
that's actually a good reason not to consolidate loans at times if you think that you have a shot of having some or all of the student loans wiped out. But
Not to
generally,
make this all about me, but I mean, I borrowed every penny of my law school education. My parents paid for college, but I went straight through, started law school at 21 and borrowed all of it. And I came out with at least 8 different federal student loans.
right.
I had Stafford and then non-Stafford, and then I think there were a few gap fillers. And for me, and I feel like I'm a fairly intelligent, organized, capable person, it was overwhelming to keep up with paying 8 different loans. And I consolidated right away,
Mhm.
just much easier. And I think I consolidated to a slightly lower interest rate.
Yeah, the direct loan
Make a good point.
program, yeah,
Yeah.
the federal direct loan program, I think is a good one. And if you can, because I think most student loans coming out, I think they're like a 10-year loan. And so you might have multiple loans, and then I think it's advantageous for folks to say, okay, and I'm sure you see this. I meet so many people and they just defer, 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 and they're just kicking the can down the road.
And interest continues to accrue,
Yeah.
right?
And it's actually a key decision of deciding whether to file bankruptcy, because it's like, well, it's so easy to defer the student loans and I'll just focus on paying my credit cards. And I'm like, no, it's really a lot more important to pay your student loans because those you can't wipe out, but your credit cards you could. And so, and then I think people always have to decide there's two roads to go down. And either you're going to go through an income-based program, you pay some of the debt back, or you should consolidate. And it kind of varies, but sometimes the answer is just take these 8 loans that you have, consolidate into one loan over 20 years instead of 10 years
That's what
at
I
a
did.
lower interest rate. And then maybe now you can afford the payment.
Right.
And maybe that's a reason why you should file bankruptcy now, so that you can stop deferring and start paying that debt.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there is meaningful relief in bankruptcy for a lot of people, even if you can't discharge your student loans for exactly the reason you're saying, get rid of your other debt, freeing up money to start paying on that. I mean, I have plenty of people who really don't have any extra income to pay student loans and probably never will. And one option for the, and they have a lot of other debt that is dischargeable. One option for them is to put them in a 13 for 3 to 5 years. They make a very minimal payment or no payment. It stops garnishment. It stops lawsuits. It stops collection activity. I mean, I've had plenty of people sued, in state court by private lenders in particular. And it just stops all of that. Now they come out, like you say, owing more than they did when they went in. But if there's really no hope of paying this, then that's a price that they're willing to pay. And I think a second prong of this that I'm sure you talk to people about as well is, if you are higher income and you do have an ability to make some payment on your student loans, but you have a lot of other dischargeable debt, you can do a 13. And under the right circumstances, at least here in my district, you can separately classify your student loans as a long-term debt and either pay them outside of the plan contractually and stay current, or, that's a very fact intensive analysis.
Yeah.
You can't, then we'll pay it in the 13. But there are a variety of ways I think that a bankruptcy can help, even if a hardship discharge is not.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And Nebraska has a similar tradition where it's a long-term debt and we are allowed to pay the regular payment outside of our bankruptcy payment. Now, we also dabble in the state of Iowa as well, just across our Missouri River. And they do the opposite approach. They take the rule that says, well, you can't, classify unsecured debts differently. And student loans and credit cards all have to get lumped together, and they just get a prorated payment out of what you pay to unsecured creditors. And so that makes a bad situation even worse. And there seems to be like a 50-50 split in the country as to how the courts approach it. But we do much of what you do. And that's where I think sometimes the bankruptcy choice makes sense, because, you can start paying on the credit cards, on the student loans. If you haven't been paying into your 401k, and that's also another controversial split issue in the country. You may contribute to your 401k during a 3 to 5 year Chapter 13 plan. And so oftentimes when I'm interviewing a new client, it's not so much about where you are today. It's like, okay, you're 40 years old, you have 2 kids, and you're trying to pay the credit cards, you're falling behind on the house, you're deferring your student loans, and you're not paying your retirement accounts because it's constantly like, well, I can't do that right now. And as soon as I get a pay raise, I hope to do that. Or as soon as I get around the corner of this problem, then I can start.
Right.
Of course, the problem is every time you get around a corner, a new problem pops up.
Adulting is hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's what I call around the corner thinking.
Yeah,
It's like as soon as I
always,
can get around,
right.
and you can try to get around a corner for a decade, and meanwhile, you're running out of time because you're 40 years old, you've got kids, you don't have any money saved up, or every time you change jobs, you tap into the 401k, which seems to be so common. And it's like, the reason you need to file a case now is to start paying your student loans, to start contributing towards your retirement, and to start using the limited years you have so that you can actually walk away from your working years, with something to show.
Exactly.
And it's kind of, I think our occupation is like going to the dentist, right? You need to do something, but you wait until the pain pops up. But we all know the smart thing is, floss the teeth and do the maintenance and get to the problem before it gets to you.
Right.
And all of that. It's a tricky issue. The student loan issue is just the hardest issue. And the few people that I meet who actually probably could get a discharge, the other problem is you have to sue the government.
Right.
And the government's big and they have really good
vast
attorneys.
resources.
And the people who probably could qualify, they can't afford to litigate.
Right.
Which is why you see so much of the case law
is so bad
issued by pro se debtors, people
right.
with no attorneys. And it's tricky.
Well, some of what you've said here in the last few minutes makes me think of a couple of things that are probably worth mentioning. Another advantage of a Chapter 13 is the co-debtor stay. And a lot of times my new clients, have overwhelming student debt that they're not paying, and mom, dad, grandma, sister, brother, son, daughter, or co-signed. And, that's not fun to have dunning calls to your relatives. And so if you go into a 13 and it's a consumer debt, like student loans are under most circumstances, you can take advantage of the co-debtor stay. Now, that's not going to help your co-debtor's credit if payments aren't being made on this, but it will stop, some of the things that take away from quality of life and quality of your family. Another thing that came to mind is the disability discharge, and that's totally unrelated to bankruptcy. But, there is a Venn diagram here. A good number of people that I see, are disabled, totally and permanently disabled. And, that's something that you can do through, I can't remember if it's the Social Security Administration. I think it is, but there is a disability discharge.
Yeah, I think if you
I think a lot of
become,
bankruptcy lawyers don't really know about that.
you're right, if you qualify for Social Security disability, then I think it's just a matter of filing a form with
That's
Department of
right.
Education, and they'll discharge those federally guaranteed loans, but
That's
not the
right.
private loans, right?
That's right. And that's a huge, boom as well. And I mean, I'm trying to think about how to say this. One of the things I like about this practice of law is I see, and I think you see, all kinds of people, all walks of life, all backgrounds. And some of my clients are very high income. And people are always surprised to hear this. A lot of them make more than I do, which is an issue for another day, but they're
Right.
doing very well. But something has happened, or three things have happened, something has brought them here and they can't pay everything on time and in full. And a lot of times those folks are in a 13. And I mean, this is honest to God conversation I have at least once a month. I'll have folks who are in a 13, and their kids are getting ready to go to college, and they're bound and determined to borrow money to finance their children's education. And, I tell them, number one, we can't do that without court permission. And sometimes we'll get court permission and sometimes we won't. But number two, let's step back here. You have saved nothing for retirement. You are 55, you are 50. Your children, if they want to go to school, they don't have to go out of state to somewhere that costs $50,000 a year. Or if that's what they want to do, they should borrow the money and pay it themselves.
Yeah, that is.
If you have the ability to help them pay those loans back, then do it. But for gosh sakes, don't mortgage your entire future on a debt that you'll never be able to get rid of when you're for themselves.
And that is a trend that I've seen over the last 20 years grow and grow and grow, because it used to be student loans were a young person's problem. And now with parent loans, I'm seeing parents who are hitting retirement age, in their 50s and their 60s, and they're the ones with
That's
the
right.
$200,000 of student loans. And it's such an emotional blackmail issue, because when your kid comes to you and you're enrolling them in school, and that parental instinct takes over, where you say, I want my kids to have a better life than me. I want them to have the opportunities that I was denied, or I wish I had pursued. And that's intense. And these schools, right out of the gate, when you go to visit the college and you talk to the financial aid counselors, those parental student loans are pushed right up front. And, it's the absolute, cocaine of financial debt. And it's just like, and I tell my clients constantly, I say, don't do it. Do not sign a parent student loan. Maybe if your kid's going to medical school, but even then, it's like they're going to get to school anyhow. And maybe they have to choose a different school. I think that there's probably different grants and types of loans they can apply for. But again, schools are businesses, and the more students they enroll, the more money that pours into the institution. And so they're signing up as many kids as they can, and they're trying to get the financing any way they can. And if it's a federal loan or a private loan or a parent loan, the schools are just getting anything in they can. And it's probably easier to get parent loans because parents have more money. And then when the schooling doesn't work out and the kid doesn't get the job they want, and I think there's so many college programs kids come out of with advanced degrees and that are interesting, but they don't really pay that well, and the kid winds up at Starbucks, right? I think Starbucks
Right.
are probably the best educated employees in
Right.
America, perhaps. 'Cause I think every other one of them has a PhD in English studies, and they're great people. But again, it goes back, there's no underwriting. There's no connection between the degree you come out with the earnings ability coming out. And you're making loans to 18 and 17-year-olds. And they just, they're depending upon the adult to guide them. And I don't think they're being guided in the best way.
Right.
And there's a financial crisis with all universities right now. It's a mess. And despite all the reform of discharging student loans through administrative rules or through bankruptcy or whatever, there's really no talk of, great, okay, so you've reformed, you've discharged some debts, but they keep making new ones. So you really haven't solved the problem. You've just taken some pressure out of it. And I think that's really where the long-term problem is to address why education, in an era of free information on the internet, why does it cost so much to have somebody certify that you know something? And I think that at some point, the system has to change as to how we declare that you know something.
Well, I think you and I may have discussed this on LinkedIn. I mean, I don't think that these two things are divorced, that the cost of higher education has just skyrocketed in the last 15 to 20 years, and student loans are readily available and not dischargeable. I think those two things are directly related. And the cost of college has gone up because there is this pot of money that students can easily access and never discharge. And thus lenders are very happy to stand there and say, have at it. I mean, I think that's where we've gotten out of whack personally.
Yeah.
I read a fair number of things. I know you do too. I mean, I think higher education has gone up like 150% over the last 20 years. And that's just unconscionable,
I think the student teacher ratio has stayed the same, but the student to administrative staff ratio has exploded.
Right.
And that's kind of where the cost is.
Right.
Well, Heather, I promised that we would do a short discussion, and of course it never works out that way. And I've eaten into more time than you and I probably anticipated, but it was fun. And
I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about this.
Yeah. So great to chat with you on student loans and other issues, and look forward to chatting with you again. And I wish you a warm spring weekend in North Carolina.
Right back at you.
Thanks, Heather. Talk to you soon.